Welcome into Final Fantasy Weekly. I'm Drew Kreisman.
And I'm Ira Kreisman.
And on this episode, we're going to be talking about everybody's favorite Final Fantasy grandpa and or uncle, Cid.
Yes, Cid.
Cid is a little bit like the series itself, tough to classify. Also like the series itself, seemingly been around forever. Made his first appearance in the second game, has been in all of the main entries ever since, and was retroactively put into the first game. And he's been in most of the side content, again, kind of like the series itself. It's hard to tell exactly what qualifies as Final Fantasy and what is more of an offshoot and a side thing. And it's hard to tell exactly how many Cids there are. And, sometimes even multiple versions of the same Cid have appeared in different properties. But one thing we know for sure is that Final Fantasy and Cid have become as interlocked as maybe any two symbols in this series.
One of the other things about Cid is, like the game itself, he's often changing. There are some core characteristics, but the dressing, the background, the degree of crankiness, all of those are subject to change, much like Final Fantasy itself.
Wanted to begin with a quote from the man himself, the creator of both Cid and of Final Fantasy. To get ourselves started, Hironobu Sakaguchi said in an interview to Electronic Gaming Monthly 2, man, those were the days back when video games were popular enough we could have multiple Electronic Gaming Monthly magazines. In August 1997, he said, "There really isn't any deep meaning to it. We just wanted to make a character that would appear in various forms in all the games. I guess I've always had a soft spot for that kind of character. Cid is like Yoda from the Star Wars series. Very intelligent and wise." And
sure.
I think, again, that speaks to what you were just talking about. In several ways, I think that a lot of how Final Fantasy started, there wasn't necessarily a super deep meaning to it. It grew in time and would kind of gain meaning as they went on. But that's something that we'll talk about as we go throughout this conversation. That being said, since it is such a big conversation and it's tough to give a complete conversation about every iteration of Cid in every Final Fantasy. So for the first time on the podcast, I have finally succeeded in coercing, forcing my brother.
You know I can beat you up anytime I want, right?
You got to drive a couple of hours, but that's probably true. But in order to, I think, give some structure to this conversation, and don't worry, we'll talk about plenty of Cids that are left off, but we do have some top 10 lists for you, so we can give a bit of priority to the Cids that we feel like are the best representations of the concept. We really didn't actually, given all the rubric setting I've forced us to do on this podcast, I didn't hold us to anything on these particular ones. This really is just, I think, for the most part, our favorite Cids, with the understanding that we both tend to think in terms of literary devices anyway, and how strong they are as characters. We both, as writers, I think of characters in that way to begin with. So mostly favorites, with some added bonus if we feel you're a particularly well-conceived character.
I gave in to this idea of creating a list because there are a lot of Cids, and trying to get every single one from every mobile game ever might have been a bit of a task. It is an interesting intellectual exercise, why you might put one above the other, or why you might admit that maybe your top 3 or 4 could have been interchanged. It does allow for talking about a theme or a character or an idea in a way that forces you to talk about what your priorities are when you're discussing what you do and do not like in storytelling. So, forcing us to talk about what we prioritize, and I think I'll get into that as we go through the list, is an interesting exercise, even if I don't want to choose favorites.
Yeah, it's funny. One of the things I felt as I was making this list is I was at first surprised by just how many there were, and then I was a little bit surprised by how many I felt like didn't make that much of a lasting impact on me. I felt like it was really easy for me to separate who my top 10 actually were, less so to order them Ordering them
Sure.
was the difficult part for me. One last bit of housekeeping before we jump into the list. Wanted to set out a couple of the most important, or what we feel are the most important characteristics of a Cid, other than being named Cid. Even though there's an exception even to that rule, there's an exception to all of these rules. The first being they tend to be older gentlemen of various degrees of crankiness, though they're usually on the high end. Of course, exceptions to both of those rules. The second, they tend to occupy, although Hironobu Sakaguchi compared him to Yoda, we see him more in the Merlin, Gandalf, Obi-Wan Kenobi vein, a guide that rarely but sometimes has a direct impact on the story, meaning that they may or may not join the party in the video games, but they tend to be more of the guide for what can be seen as the main character. 3, they tend to be related in some way to the advancement of technology, and along with that, tend to be related to the airship in any given game. 4, they typically have a connection of some kind to the villains or the Empire. Usually, they end up betraying the Empire on behalf of the heroes. 5, there's almost always a really memorable standout scene for the Cid at some point in the game, if not multiple ones, and there's almost always an incorporation of the technology and a big escape at some point during that scene. And the 6th, and maybe the most important one, is that Cid can almost always be a reflection or a representation of the thematic core of whatever Final Fantasy game he is in. With that, let's get into it. We're going to do this as follows. I'll start with my number 10, and then we'll go to Ira's number 10. If we have repeats throughout, we'll try to just mention that. But each time we get to a new character, we're going to dive into that one a little bit. Starting with my number 10, drum roll. And we don't have a last name. We couldn't find... some of these we've got last names for. I'm calling him Al-Bhed Cid from Final Fantasy X.
On the crankiness meter, ranks pretty high, I would say.
He ranks pretty high also on the having a cool airship and a cool look and an interesting role in the story meter. One of the things that I really like about this version of the Cid is that his crankiness is well understood as the leader of a group of outcasts, of racial outcasts even, that the Al-Bhed are ostracized for their role in embracing technology in a world where you're not supposed to do that. And I think he stands as an interesting representation and reflection of that, and also as an outsider is a bit more foreign to our main cast than a lot of the other Cids in the series might be.
Sure, they're not really interested in trusting him too much. I mean, other than Riku, who is his daughter, and Yuna, who is his niece. The rest of the group is a bit wary of him, especially Waka. Waka's the one who holds a lot of those racial prejudices further into the game, further into the story than I would have thought.
Also, a common theme for a great Cid is a fantastic and memorable escape scene, and he has
nice.
One of the best. He, spoilers, blows up home, as it's called, in a pretty dramatic scene, and pretty memorable escape there for the party. So again, stuff that he does that impacts the squad. Also, I know at the time it was controversial. I like the design for the airship in Final Fantasy X a lot. I think it strikes a really cool in-between balance of old style and futuristic looking, and so I've always thought that whole aesthetic of them together really cool. All right, number 10 on Ira's list, Cid Randell from Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. Probably someone that people, I think I maybe even overlooked him a little bit. So tell us a bit about Cid Randell.
Sure. The Cids from the Tactics games don't fall into the same tropes that the Cids in the numbered games do, and in that they're generally not engineers. Instead, they tend to be really badass warriors. Cid Randell, in the sort of make-believe version of Ivalice that our heroes find themselves in, he is changed from the depressed, almost slovenly, now a heavy drinker. After the death of his wife, he sort of fell into this depression. And when Mute Randall, his son, is able to remake some of the world the way he wants it, he makes his father, Cid Randall, into the Judge Master of this fairy tale version of Ivalice. So as a Judge Master, he gets to set the laws and enforce the laws, and he's the one who gives out red cards, by the way.
Yeah.
And so I just think it's, from a story perspective, I think it's interesting because instead of being a father figure, he's literally a father. And he's taking this position of authority in this magical land because it was given to him by his son's imagination, which just strikes me as an interesting way to tell a story. Like, this is who I want my father to be. I'm not happy with who he is now. This is who I want him to be. And he is, when he finally joins the party, he is, much like a Cid that's probably higher on both our lists, a powerhouse. And that is also interesting from a gameplay point of view.
Yeah, I love everything about that character. Like you said, I think I mostly overlooked him and wasn't really remembering it as strongly. I need to go back and play Tactics Advance before we talk about it at some point on the podcast because, yeah, all of that stuff is remarkably compelling. And so I think the only thing that dropped that one off my list was just the lack of remembering him, but that doesn't necessarily mean he was less memorable. Definitely worth going back and diving into that character. I'm actually going to skip over my number 9 for right now, so I'm already bucking the rules that I just made up.
I was going to say, you set rules.
I know.
All right.
I'm getting rid of them because my number 9 is ranked much higher on your list.
Okay.
And I think that'll be an interesting conversation for later. So let's go to your number 9.
Sure.
Another one that did not make my list.
Okay. All right. Cid Previa, or Previa maybe, of Final Fantasy V. He's actually part of a duo in Final Fantasy V. It's Cid and his grandson Mid. They are the engineers of the world of Final Fantasy V. And if you know anything about Final Fantasy V, you know saying the world of Final Fantasy V is a bit misleading. He is responsible for the machines that the various kingdoms are using to enhance the power of the crystals, which eventually leads to their... So he does this because it makes life in those kingdoms easier, right? But having done so, it makes the crystals fragile, and then Exdeath's goons are able to shatter them, and that's how Exdeath gets released. So when you first meet Cid in Final Fantasy V, he's in jail because he's trying to get the Fire Kingdom, whose name escapes me at the moment, to stop using the amplifier machine that he created because he knows what's coming. He has seen his mistake and he wants to stop it, and he uses his last explosives not to escape prison, but to accidentally enter your cell. So he and his grandson provide a bit of the comedy relief in Final Fantasy V. They also do that thing that a lot of Cids do, where they are at least partially responsible for the rise of the bad guy. So in this case, it's not any one kingdom that's becoming the evil empire, but rather that he's making it so that Exdeath can be released from his prison by making the crystals brittle. There's also an interesting artistic... it's not really a goof, but it's a quirk, I guess. In the portrait art, Cid does not wear glasses, but his sprite does. And in the portrait art of his grandson, Mid wears glasses, but his sprite does not. So that's a peculiar little difference that I like to note. Yeah.
And my reaction to this pick is similar to the last one. I remember Cid and Mid. I remember them as a quality, as you kind of put it, comedic act. Nice little duo. Didn't stand out in my memory as much, but was in contention to make my number 10 spot. And some of that, I think, was probably just ultimately my feelings toward Final Fantasy X ended up outweighing my feelings toward Final Fantasy V, which is not necessarily the exercise we're supposed to be doing here.
We're making up these rules and breaking them as we go. We can do whatever we want.
That's exactly right. So let's move into number 8 because we both have the exact same number 8.
How about that?
I think it fits perfectly in this spot, obviously. I think this is about right. And again, one that other people might not even include, might not say counts. We say he very much counts.
Yes.
The only Cid who spells it with an S. Dr. Cid of Final Fantasy, The Spirits Within, as voiced by Donald Sutherland.
Yeah, Dr. Sid Sutherland is... I don't think he's given it a last name, right?
No, I don't believe so. Or maybe Cid
right.
is supposed to be his last name. I think that's one of the things that people weren't so sure about. Has a bit of a ring of Mr. Cid to it, though.
Right. So I talked a lot about Cid Previa. Why don't you start us off with Dr. Cid?
So one of the things that's always been interesting to me about the conversation surrounding Final Fantasy, The Spirits Within, is the number one critique has always been it's not Final Fantasy enough. It doesn't bear enough of a resemblance to the games. Just keep that in mind for a moment. Cid is a scientist studying the Gaia theory, which suggests that when beings die, they do not completely cease to exist, but instead join something akin to the life stream in Final Fantasy VII or going to the far plane in Final Fantasy X. It is built around this ideology that Hironobu Sakaguchi is famous for really embracing after the death of his mother. Cid and the main character, Dr. Aki Ross, voiced by Mulan and
yes,
May, Agent Melinda May of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D.,
right,
are tasked with proving to the world that the Gaia theory is real and are therefore seen as outcasts in the story. And without getting too much into the entirety of that movie, because you better believe we're going to jump into that on this podcast and talk about it.
We've got it planned.
This Cid, in terms of importance to the story of a Final Fantasy thing, is as integral to what happens and the thematic core as well, not just the plot, but as we've always talked about, the themes. And there's a pretty great scene early on in the movie, one of his first, after they've just come from not really being able to convince the council and things like science, where he burns all of his notes and he tells Dr. Ross to keep all of her notes in her head so that they don't end up in jail for the rest of their lives for promoting outlandish, scary theories. And
which sounds familiar to certain real-world scientists of days gone by.
And not so gone by. So I think this Cid really is a fantastically conceived and developed character. I love that he's voiced by Donald Sutherland. It's a great voice. It's a classic Hollywood voice on top of all of these other things. And so, yeah, man, I just, and I know some people don't get into it, but I do feel an attachment to Dr. Cid in a lot of ways and feel like he is as much the hero of that story as Aki Ross.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think I really have anything to add. I think he's a great character. I think it's a great voice. I think he fits a lot of the tropes. He's got the father figure thing going on. He's got the advanced technology thing going on. I know I said I wasn't going to say anything, but that's just how I roll. I know how to ramble.
Well, and even knowing that he works for the man, if we can broadly categorize the Empire as the people who hold power, and in this case it is the military of the people he's working for who go way over the top and end up doing some terrible stuff.
Right. Oof.
So that relationship, it's all there. It's all very similar, but still quite different. All right, let's move on. Number 7 on my list, and I must admit that this is largely and I bemoan this when other people do it at times, but I just like this character because I think he's cool. I think he looks cool. I think he sounds cool. I barely remember how much of an impact he had on the plot, but Al Cid from Final Fantasy XII.
Sure.
Purple hair and his ridiculous outfit and his voice. The sunglasses. The accent on his voice, I could listen to that voice forever. And he also gets some really quality writing. He mostly plays the rogue who helps the story along a little bit. He's the second of 2 Cids in this game, and we'll get back to that. So in a way, he's even overshadowed in his own game. I just know that for me, like a guttural reaction whenever he showed up on screen. I was like, yes, that guy's here. He's going to say some cool stuff and walk out. And we're all going to be like, whoa.
I believe that officially, according to whomever gets to say things officially, he is not the Cid of Final Fantasy XII. But, how much the author, or authors in this case, get to make that determination, I think is fun to play with. So yeah, that's an interesting choice. I got to admit, other than, the hat and the sunglasses and the voice, I don't remember a lot about this guy.
Yeah, I totally understand that. Like I said, I'm not sure I do either. And sometimes that's okay too. Let's so the next 7 on your list is Al Bhed Cid, who we have
Cid of the Al
covered.
Bhed, who we've already talked about. So you ranked your Al Bhed Cid at number 10. I ranked mine at 7. I think for me, the reason I ranked him higher was as much about the attitude. I kind of love his cranky, get it done attitude, and I just that bumped him a few. So when we're talking about what I prioritize as far as characters or as far as Cid characters, attitude might be part of it.
So number 6 on my list. Does this qualify as a Cid? Technically not, because what I'm about to say is not the word Cid, but number 6 on my list. Cindy.
Dude.
From Final Fantasy 15.
People are going to be up in arms. The 20 people who listen to this podcast and have opinions, they're going to be up in arms over this choice.
Perhaps, but I stand by it. I really enjoyed the final execution of the Cindy character and concept. Like a lot of people, when I first saw her in trailers, I was a little bit taken aback. Final Fantasy, we talked about it even going back to the Final Fantasy IV character designs, some of the women maybe being specifically trying to be alluring, but even those are far more subtle than what Cindy is wearing in 15. And we can be honest about that. She's clearly designed to be enticing. She's got a lot of skin showing, a lot of cleavage, her butt's coming out of her shorts. I get it. I get all of that. And I also understand that it's not practical for her job, which is mechanic. That being said, the outfits I ran around with in the boys for that whole... the boys wearing the outfits, those were not practical for what I was doing either. But I think, like any critique of a character like that would say, you can't just boil a character down to how they look any more than you can a person. And Cindy as a character to me was exceptionally interesting, always holding her own in conversations with the prince. Like, she brings the prince down a notch.
Yes.
She is unequivocally their buddy, despite their position. The men do not treat her. They talk once in a while about liking her, but they don't talk about her physical attributes. They don't swoon over her. They treat her with respect. She's the smartest engineer around, taking after her father and being able to do things like make your car fly. Right. And she's got a great deal of her own personality, and it reminds me a lot of plenty of women that I know who are, they're a bit more open about showing their body than sometimes I'm like, yeah, you sure? There's a lot of gross dudes out there that are but they're like, whatever, I'm confident, I feel good, and part of looking this way helps me feel confident. And I felt like her drive and confidence really helped the guys. She's more confident than any of those guys, and she had to help them through their journey every step of the way. And I think that, I really, really loved her.
I agree. Cindy is a fantastic character. Her design is a bit off-putting, especially from the practical point of view. That said, learning her backstory, learning about why she is interested in mechanics, especially in headlights, that particular detail is especially important. And knowing that it's not cranky old Cid of Hammerhead Service Station who gets your car to fly, who gives you your airship, but rather Cindy. So it had not occurred to me to include Cindy as even a possibility. She doesn't appear on my list at all. But considering that she has those qualities, I think she does count as a Cid. So well done. Nice choice.
And again, part of it is the outfit, but she's very memorable. She's one of the main characters of that story. In fact, there have been talks about whether or not there would be an all-female spin-off featuring Luna Freya, Iris, and Cindy, and Aranaya.
That would be fun.
Yeah.
Holy cow.
I would play that game. I would play it a lot.
So the boys show up at Hammerhead Station, right? And they go and they stay in the camper off to the left there. And Cindy calls up her buddies.
And they go for a joyride.
They take the regalia. Yeah. Hey,
Love it.
The boys don't know this can happen yet. Watch what happens when I push this button.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds like fun. All right. Yeah. I dig it.
All right. So number 6 on your list. I found this interesting, and I went back and forth on whether or not to include him on my list. Obviously, decided not to, but I'm very interested to hear your argument. You might talk me into the fact that I may have made a mistake here. Professor Robin Williams, Cid Kramer from Final
Headmaster
Fantasy
of Balam Garden. So I got to think that he was in charge of choosing the music that plays when you run around the hallways.
See, already you're talking me into it. That's the best campus music that's maybe ever been written.
So I like this Cid. And again, the rankings are hard for me. Like, why is this Cid above Al Bhed Cid? Tough to say. I think one of the reasons that I chose this Cid at all was because of the moment where he reveals that Balam Garden is, in fact, the airship. And then you get to drive this giant school around the world map. It's just such a cool moment. Like, we're in this bad situation. I think there are motorcycles being catapulted at us. And he just sort of like reveals, oh yeah, I've got one more trick up my sleeve. He's not as engineering as a lot of the Cids. He's also not quite as cranky. In fact, he's a little more reserved. In the relationship between him and his wife, the sorceress Adia, he is the more passive of them. He's the less aggressive of them. So on the crankiness scale, he ranks pretty low. But he is fascinating to me for that. He's really a leader who leads with quiet confidence as opposed to any sort of bluster. And I really appreciate that about him. Again, the ranking is a bit odd. I think Dr. Cid of Spirits Within has a lot of those same quiet qualities that I appreciate. Why is Cid Kramer above Dr. Cid? I don't know. My brother made me make a list. But that moment when he turns the garden into an airship, and then all the flashbacks where it turns out he and Adia are just like raising kids on the beach are really touching to me. So I chose him for that father figureness that Cid Randell also has. I don't know, man. What do you think?
I think he's a great character, and again, one that I remembered. I think some of my critiques of him are perhaps misplaced. I think that because he's kind of undercut a couple of times by that weird Norg thing, having been, in charge secretly of the garden for a little while, and that he doesn't really do a whole lot. Like you mentioned, he's more passive in a game that has a lot more angst coming from its main characters, and so that's kind of an interesting reversal, but leads to him stepping aside for Squall and Adia and other people to take the more lead role, which I guess ultimately they all do.
Sure.
So I'm not quite sure why I would hold that against him, but yeah, I mean, he's a good character. You're right. The reveal about the garden being the airship is really cool and fantastic. I know some people hated it because they would say there's no actual airship in that game. But, well, I mean, there's the dragon later, but that's a spaceship, so whatever. But yeah, anyway, I don't know that you talked me into putting him on my list, but I'm glad you've got him on yours, and that's one of the things that I think is cool and fun and interesting about doing these. All right, let's get to another one where somehow we actually both ended up with the exact same pick.
It's worth noting that we created our list independently, and I still haven't seen Drew's list. I'm just taking his word for all of this.
Right, and that's going to be interesting when we get to the next one, too, but... Yeah, you have not seen both lists. I'm the only one that has. And at number 5, we both have TG, the Thunder God, Sidolphus Orlandu from Final Fantasy Tactics. And not just because he looks almost exactly like Obi-Wan Kenobi and destroys all of the monsters in that game and becomes super awesome, badass, powerful member of your party, and everything he says is cool and...
that is a big part of it, though.
Actually,
that's a big part of the reason. Yeah. Sidolphus Orlandu, as the Cids of Ivalice are named. They're all named Sidolphus, I think. Yeah, he's being an incredible badass is a big part of it. It's almost a little disappointing when you get him because all these characters you've been building up this whole time pale in comparison. But it's also just interesting the turn that he makes, right? He's fighting for one of the royal families. He's fighting for one of the lions and has been for a long time. And when you finally meet up with him, he's about had it. And he decides that, you know what, I'm going to throw in with these heretics because they actually are interested in fighting for the common man, which is why I got into this in the first place. It's not like I wanted to go around slaughtering enemy soldiers with my badassery. It was I wanted to fight for what's right.
I guess in that way he is a lot like Obi-Wan Kenobi, who, I mean, he never really fought for the Empire, but at some point there was a minute there where it was difficult to tell the Republic from the Empire. And,
sure.
A lot of those people used to be his friends, and I guess the stormtroopers would be the biggest example of that, right? Like that army used to be his army.
Oh, sure. The Commander Cody, in particular, in Attack of the Clones, seems to have a good relationship with General Kenobi. And it's worth noting that the Jedi Order, throughout those 3 films, the Jedi Order is not the hero of those movies. There are individual Jedi, like individually the Jedi are heroic, but the Jedi Order has done goofed, and the culmination of that goof, I think, speaks volumes at the end of Revenge of the Sith. So similarly, the Thunder God, Sidolphus Orlandu, has about had it with the hubris of I can't even remember whose side he's on in the War of the Lions.
I can't either, but ultimately,
when we get to that game,
there are no good sides in
right.
And that's what he discovers, again putting him kind of at the thematic core of the game. And again, though, I don't know that there's a whole lot having to do with him and engineering. Mustadio kind of carries that role in that story.
Yeah, the tactics Cids don't really engineer. They just bad the ass, as it were.
But he did, play a role at one point for an army that he has since forsaken. Very common Cid trope. Speaking of which, that gets me to my number 4. A Cid that I think does not appear on your list because you haven't gotten as far through the game. I have now finally completed just the base game for Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn, and I'm a bit into the post-game content. And knowing that there's probably still more development and more cool, as you put it, assing of the battery, nope, not quite, to come from Cid Garland, which, first of all, having that as a last name is a pretty fantastic addition to your Final Fantasy resume, a throwback to the first game. One of the things that I do not know about this character in full, I do know that he played a role in the original Final Fantasy XIV that was not a success, we'll say.
Right.
And had
before the realm was reborn.
Right. And so he's got this built-in backstory that they can reference that some people are going to understand. I don't understand entirely, but like that he has that backstory there, that he doesn't remember who he is for most of the story of A Realm Reborn. He doesn't remember that he was an engineer for the Empire, helped them in the discovery and invention of Magitech and their ability to take over much of the realm with those powers. became a member of the Scions of the Seventh Dawn, rebelled against the Empire. I'm going to do a big spoiler alert right now, but because it was a major part of what played into him making my top 5, despite the fact that this is the newest Cid to me by far. I go back 25 years with some of these other Cids, but there is a scene right near the final confrontation where the leader of the Empire begs Cid Garland to come back and be his lead of engineering again. And the back and forth that they have, he essentially speaks for every Cid who ever existed in this monologue that he gets to give. And I just, I was like, yeah, this is an excellent character. I love his design. I love what they did with, you having to help him remember who he is and then helping him restore his airship, the Enterprise, to its full glory. I think he, as a character, is essentially an homage to all of the Cids that have come before him. And that's a pretty cool thing to have pulled off.
I do like this character. You're right. I don't know him as well as you do. My experience with gaming online is almost universally negative. And I realize I can play most of that game without interacting with people, but still, it's just one of those things that I tend not to get into. But what I know of him, I like. I like seeing him work with the big dude and the little dude.
Biggs and Wedge, man.
Yeah, Biggs and Wedge. So yeah, I think what I know of him, I like. He just didn't, make my list.
Yeah, but I think especially once the full kind of party comes together at the end of that game, and he's again a father figure leading, doing all the cool stuff, bringing the Scions of the Seventh Dawn together in a climactic conclusion. I really enjoyed that. So let's get to your number 4, though. So this is another interesting one.
Is it? I thought this was almost an obvious choice. Cids Sophiar of Final Fantasy 15. Old man Cid, sitting in his lawn chair, letting his... Cindy's his granddaughter or his daughter?
I think granddaughter.
Okay. So letting his granddaughter take over Hammerhead. He does have... He's definitely got the engineering thing going on. He's not really in any way connected with the Empire. He is, however, connected to the King of Lucius, Sean Bean himself. In that they were old buddies, they adventured together. He will help out when it comes to fixing up your mechanical weapons, so your auto crossbow and not your gun blade, but like your engine blade.
Yeah.
Yeah, which I don't understand, but that's cool. Again, the crankiness factor comes in here. I like him. I like that he's so crusty. I like that he's got so much attitude. That he's got such a history, and we barely know any of it. And we know it's important to Noctis's father and ultimately to Noct because Cid can tell Noctis about his dad some, and that whole relationship was strained, and so that makes for some interesting storytelling. I just think he's a really interesting character. I like how he has sidelined himself. I like how he only does things, he's only taken on the small jobs. He really has stepped back in a way that Sid Kramer did too, to let the kids take over. My time has passed. I'm happy to be here and help out when I'm needed. I've got a few words of advice. They got a little crust on them, but they're good for you.
Yeah, I can't disagree with any of that. I obviously just went to his granddaughter for my pick for that role in that game, but he's pretty awesome. Another thing I really like is that there's a picture that tells like a whole story. You just see this indeed. One picture of him with the king and a couple other buddies out on an adventure, very much like the one you're going through now, and it just fills you with this whole understanding of what their adventure might have been like, and because it's similar to the one you're going on now, and the importance of his buddies, and like you said, that relationship got strained is tragic, especially knowing how much Noctis is going to need his buddies. And so
right
in this one moment, in this one picture, you get like an entire cautionary tale of remember your buddies.
So Cids Sophiar did not make your list at all, is that right?
Yeah, and again, like why? How is that even possible? I think probably just because in my brain I went, who was the Cid from 15? Oh yeah, it was more Cindy than anything, and I just went that way with it. And I almost wish I could do a cop-out and combine them as one character and put them near the top of my list. But no, they're two very different characters.
I think they're too distinct for that. I think you could do that with Cid and Mid of 5, but I don't think you do that with Cid and Cindy of 15.
No. And, in hindsight, after having just listened to your argument, I may, or not even argument, just discussing the character, I maybe even would have to kick Albed Cid off my list and put Sophiar in there at number 10.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's keep going here. Because at number 3, very high on my list, I've got someone you don't have on yours. And again, I can guess probably why, and I'm going to make a run at this name. Dr. Sidolphus Demon Bunansa, otherwise known as Nethicite Cid from Final Fantasy XII.
Yeah.
This is the Cid that goes the other way. The Cid that does not successfully throw off the yoke of the Empire and join the revolution, despite given many opportunities to do so, and despite the fact that his son, Balthier, has joined the revolution. He has been driven mad by the power of the technology, in this case the Nethicite, that he has been engineering, manufacturing, as they say, and it has driven him insane. He's also been messed with by the gods of this world. Dr. Sidolphus, you keep expecting him, or at least I did, to turn, to show you some kind of redeemable quality, even if he doesn't fully come to the side of the good guys, because he's a Cid, to do something to help the team, to see the error of his ways. And that he remains gone made his tragedy for me stick that much harder. Plus, when he goes full tilt crazy and turns himself into a monster and attacks you, it's really cool and awesome.
That was a neat scene. I agree.
Yeah. But and maybe he stands out again. Maybe I'm leaning on the old Speed Racer methodology of uniqueness. He stands out to me because he's the one Cid that remains villainous to the very end, and it broke my heart, man.
Yeah, it's an interesting move to make a Cid a full-on bad guy. Never does in any way even attempt to redeem himself. I think he's an interesting character. He just didn't resonate with me for some reason. I don't have a good justification for that. He's a good character. He's interesting, but he does not resonate with me the way some of the other Cids do. It is also worth noting that Bunansa is also Mustadio's last name. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're related, but Mustadio and his father Besrudio from Final Fantasy Tactics do share a surname with Dr. Sidolphus Demon Bunansa.
Yeah, that's fun.
Well, and they are also engineers, right? They're the engineers of Tactics.
Right. Okay, let's move on now to your number 3 and my number 2, because they are the same. And it is one we've talked about a little bit recently because we've already covered this game. Our favorite great big bearded Cid. Cid Polendina of Final Fantasy IV.
It's worth noting, I don't think we mentioned this when we talked about the art, music, and gameplay of Final Fantasy IV, but Cid Polendina's beard in the sprite form is auburn, reddish-orange, but in the artwork it's all black.
Yeah. So, another one of those weird quirks of how you change things from the sketches into the 2D art. And this whole character was a great big piece of 2D art. He was animated and jumping around the screen, and when he sacrifices himself in a blaze of glory, there's a lot of sacrifice in that game, but very little blaze of glory until Cid jumps off the airship with a grenade in hand.
For me, this character is a lot about that attitude again. He is sort of father figure. He is the crazy uncle. I think I put him this high at least as much for his sacrifice as I did because he looks like a pirate from a Studio Ghibli film.
Right. And I think, and we'll jump into this in a little bit. I'm going to put it off for a moment, but I also think you've got to give some of those, we've talked about them at kind of Beatles points.
Sure.
You've got to give some points to this Cid, though he was not the first. We'll talk about in a minute why there has to be a Cid character in every Final Fantasy game, but I think this one is a big part of the reason why. You go back and you see the role that he played, and it's kind of it is the prototype.
Sure.
It is the blueprint for what Cid should be. And light warriors are bound to need an Obi-Wan Kenobi, but maybe with a little more of that stuff you're talking about. A little more of that.
The crazy uncle Obi-Wan. Yeah.
Right.
A little Han in there, Obi-Wan.
Yeah. So let's go then to your number 2 and my number 9 that I skipped over.
Okay.
Cid del Norte Marquez, which, by the way, I did not know that was his full
I
name.
only know that because of the wiki.
Does that mean that he is of some sort of Hispanic, probably not descent, but inspiration?
Maybe. I mean, are the Cidolfuses of Germanic inspiration? I don't know.
Perhaps.
So anyway, yeah, I really like this character. It's at least partially because he is the Cid of Final Fantasy VI. And I cannot separate Final Fantasy VI from my very being. I love this guy. I like him a lot. He's a more passive Cid, but he's still got some of that crustiness on him. He's a father figure to a lot of characters in the game. Mostly Celeste, but also General Leo. I think he feels responsible for what happened to Kefka, as he should. I think he feels responsible for what happened to Terra, as he should, and he tries to make amends from within. He's in Emperor Gestal's clutches, and he's trying to figure out, how do I create these Magitech devices, as I have been ordered to, without killing the Espers? And he kind of figures it out, but it's still torturous, right? And it's killing him. And then he's got one of the best sequences in any Final Fantasy ever, where I was
going to say, my thing is memorable scenes, and who's in a more memorable scene.
If you don't catch enough fish...
It's okay, you can say it.
If you don't catch enough fish, Cid will die. And then Celeste, who's the one who's trying to catch fish, will throw herself off the cliff. It's just, my God, I cannot not rank him highly because of all of those things. It's such a conflicted character, and that's why he's my number 2. Though I got to say, I would say my number 4, 3, and 2, I could have swapped. My number 1, though, is strongly number 1.
Yeah, I think I did too much thinking with my head and not enough with my heart on this one, even as you just described it. I ranked him lower on my list because he's not actually in the game all that much. His, if you want to call it screen time, is relatively low compared to the rest of the people that I've got on my list. But I should at least have him over Alcid. Come on, that's ridiculous. I think I was trying to fight against what you were talking about, which is, well, it's the Final Fantasy VI one, and that game is so damn good that, and that scene is so good that I didn't want to, but you're right, he's more than just the one scene, and the conflict, again, his conflict is at the center of that game's themes, and great escape scene, great not-so-escape scene. I may have to rethink my positioning of him, though. I still think I'm going to keep him outside of my top 5 just based on the others given more room to do some stuff. just doing some stuff out there. Before we do our number one pick, which, by the way, is the same pick, and there's been... Anyway, if you're listening to this, you're probably noticing a glaring omission to this point in the conversation. You can probably guess who it's going to be. Let's talk about a few of the Cids that did not make our list real briefly. There was the very first Cid in Final Fantasy II, a former Knight of Finn. Doesn't really make much of an impact, dies in an Imperial bombing, but not a whole lot to remember about that Cid. We talked about Mr. Cid from Final Fantasy III, which that's maybe the most interesting thing about him is that he's Mr. Cid.
Right. He does have a last name. His last name's Hayes, but I don't think you learned that in the game.
Right. We didn't talk, interestingly, about Cid Fabul from Final Fantasy IX, who is memorable for being turned into an Oglop.
Right. Yeah, this Cid doesn't strike me... I mean, I remember him. I played that game a couple times. He's fine.
It's fine. Yeah. Doesn't really get to do much. There are a lot more interesting characters in that game, for sure. We can put another check mark next to haven't played Final Fantasy XI, but there is, of course, a Hume engineer of Bastok, as we looked up, named Cid. Final Fantasy XIII, Cid Reigns, is a character, I remember the design. I just don't remember that much about his role in that game, and it might be, again, just 13 not sticking with me as much.
I played that game once. I barely remember Cid Reigns. In fact, I think I remember Alcid Margrace, more than I remember Cid Reigns.
Yeah. I absolutely, obviously.
Yeah, because he's on your list.
My list. But if there's anyone out there, again, we'll always say this. You want to write a passioned argument in favor of Cid Reigns as a super interesting character, then let us know, and we'll take a look at it. Absolutely. We did not talk about any of the Final Fantasy, Tactics Advance 2.
I actually like this character. Yeah,
Cid.
he's like the wolf people. He's actually, I think this is an interesting character. He's also not an engineer. He's more, in the being a badass warrior trope. I think he's an interesting character, but I don't have a lot to say about him. Obviously, he didn't stick with me as strongly as the ones on my list.
Another one that you have played a lot more than me, you actually finished this game, was Final Fantasy Type O. I do not remember this.
Well, kind of like Dr. Cid Nethicite, he is an antagonist the entire time. He's the military leader of one of the factions. I can't remember which faction off the top of my head. And you're really fighting against him and his soldiers the whole time. He does not treat his faction very well. It's whereas your faction, the Vermilion Bird faction, lives in a really nice place. Their place is run down. It's kind of totalitarian regime looking. I mean, it looks like the pictures you see when you look at totalitarian regimes from history and or present day. But it also turns out that he's trying to free the world from the cycle of the gods, controlling everybody's destiny. So he's not, while he's an antagonist the whole time, he's not really a bad guy. He's not on my list because Type 0 is just not that great a game to me. There's a lot of interesting things going on, but yeah, he didn't crack the top 10.
And our last two other Cids from other content, for real, are Otto Cid Beckenstein from Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, and the android from World of Final Fantasy is the other one. Let's talk about these two real quick.
So the Otto from Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, I didn't know he was a Cid until I started researching Cids for this podcast. I just knew him as Otto. So the fact that he's got a Cid in his name is gratifying, but again, World of Final Fantasy, the android, I might not like this, Cid. You want to try to turn me around on that?
No. I didn't hate him. I've got a pretty high tolerance for stuff that's just kind of irritating or grating, which I think there's a couple of characters in that game that can kind of be that way, but I certainly wouldn't argue for any kind of deep, compelling nature to this character at all.
And it's worth mentioning that there are a whole host of other Cids. There's a Lilty guy from one of the Crystal Chronicles. The Record Keeper game has a Cid. We didn't really get into the mobile games for those Cids, and clearly, though I've played some of them, none of them have stuck out to me as being worthy of being on a list. Okay.
Yeah, no.
Sure.
All right. And with that, we come to number 1 Cid, Prime Cid. I honestly think if you're being objective here, this is the number 1 Cid. This is the greatest Cid of all time. And it is, of course, Cid Highwind of Final Fantasy VII.
Man, what a cool character.
He really is.
So I've been talking about the Krusty scale. This guy actually uses foul language, right? I think he and Sophia of 15 are the crustiest, but Cid Highwind gets to curse. He smokes. He's an engineer. He's not really much of a father figure to anyone in the party, I don't think. But he does get to go to space.
No.
Also, he's also a dragoon.
Yeah, I saw some debate about that recently, about whether or not he counted because he just carries a spear and does jump. But his last name is also Highwind. But I get he doesn't wear the armor, and he doesn't belong to like a class or a school of dragoons. But that's clearly his character class, right?
The only other characters named Highwind are Richard Highwind from 2, Cain Highwind from 4, King Tycoon from Final Fantasy V is Alexander Highwind Tycoon, Fang Highwind from 13, and Aranea Highwind from 15. And the only one of those I would say is maybe not a dragoon is King Tycoon, but he flies on a Windrake, and we never really see him fight, but my guess is he's meant to be a dragoon.
Yeah. But yeah, I love this Cid. I love his character design. I love his theme. I love his interaction in the story with the main characters, at first being reluctant to give a damn. He's got his own goals. He's got the tragic story of having to cancel his trip to space in order to save his wife. Really, really heartbreaking scene, memorable scene there. So we've talked about that on our, and he's got a few of them. He plays a major role, obviously, as a main character of one of the more memorable casts in the series. And he also appears in a lot of other stuff. He's in Advent Children, gets to be, pretty cool in that. He plays a major role in Kingdom Hearts.
Yes, he does.
It's that even if it's a different version, it's still this Cid Highwind.
Right.
It's
not smoking a cigarette though.
Right. Was he chewing on a stick? Straw.
I think he's got a toothpick or something. Yeah.
Yeah. And very little swearing.
Comparatively, very little swearing.
Even himself is an indelible Final Fantasy image, and part of that just comes with being in Final Fantasy VII.
Right.
I get that.
Yeah.
But, fair enough. Okay, so with our list now complete, and we've objectively identified the 10 best Cids who ever existed.
See, that's why I don't like lists.
I know, right? But let's ask a big question, as we like to do at the end of as many podcasts as we can. And I'll steal a phrase and ask, must there be a Cid? Let's go back to what Hironobu Sakaguchi said. In the beginning, there was no point to it, and we have to, bow to the creator and say, yeah, okay, there was no point to it in the beginning. Here we are, 30 years after the beginning. There have been all of these Cids. We just had this whole conversation about how they stand for the core and thematic elements in movies and games and very successful properties. Our attachment to them, some of them very recent, some of them stretching back a long, long time. We both had Cid Polendina from Final Fantasy IV, released in 1991, 1992, in our top 5. Why?
Yeah. I think one of the things that Final Fantasy does well, and we've said it over and over and over again, is it does something new. It does something different. It's as much about change as it is anything else. And so to have a through line, to have a character that you can look at and say, okay, I may not know anything else about this world, but I know that guy. Or I know a guy kind of like that guy. Or I know a version of that guy. I've seen this guy somewhere before, and I know what he's about. Maybe. Either he's a sword saint, or he's a headmaster, or he's an engineer, or maybe he's gone mad because the gods messed with his brain. But I know something about this guy. It gives us a familiar quality, a familiar through line to help us understand the rest of the story. And you could have the craziest plot line in the world, and if there were a Cid in it, it would at least give you a spot from which you could stand and try to understand what's going on. You can stand in that spot and say, okay, I have a handle on this more or less. Through this lens, how can I understand the themes?
Yeah, even our top Cid, Highwind, is kind of the straight man in a story with a dog with a flaming tail and a kid with a sword bigger than his body and spiky hair. And his job is to kind of stand there like any normal person would and say, what the is going on here?
I don't think you're allowed to say that on a podcast.
Just like they did in 1997, there are things we can do to censor such language. And so we shall. Because I think that's, what a lot of people would be doing. I think furthermore, as you mentioned, that he's kind of a lens with which we can see any of these stories that helps us kind of ground them in something a bit more familiar. His role, as we've talked about, usually having something to do with the advancement of technology, reminds us that every single Final Fantasy game has something to say, both in terms of what it's actually saying with its story and how it's implemented, constructed, sometimes even the way it's released. We talked about with Final Fantasy IV going from almost pure fantasy to almost pure science fiction. And characters like Cid, or the Cids of each game, are representations of that idea. You talked about it being change, but a more specific idea of change for the betterment, science and knowledge as a symbol of something good, but also of something potentially dangerous. And we've talked about that. We usually see it go from the used for bad to used for good throughout the story. That's usually the direction it goes, except for in 12 when it's used for bad and stays for bad.
Well, and in a way, I think that Cid is representative of... usually this is a guy we can count on to some degree, and even he could not stand up to the corruption of the gods. So Cid's a fun character, yeah? A fun trope, a fun thing to include in every chapter of this ongoing multiverse-spanning story.
Yeah, I think so. I think in some ways he's the, oh my God, you killed Kenny, that just you need to have
Speaking
a
of
familiar
language.
thing. Right. You need to have that familiar thing. But in many ways, he does have to serve a particular role, not necessarily good or bad, but of reminding us of the potential of technology.
And often science fiction is about the warning of, if we go too far with that technology, the Red Wings appear, or Magitech armor, or the Nethicite, or who knows what. So it's worth being, like we talked about, Fleet Master Cid crowns King Cecil Harvey at the end of Final Fantasy IV, and how oftentimes in real life that was the job of the religious figure. The king, has the power of being a king because God says so. Well, in Final Fantasy IV, Cecil takes on the role of the king because he's a hero, but also because science says so, or because understanding the world from a scientific standpoint says so. So maybe that's another way to think of it.
So Cid is a reminder to be wise about how we implement and embrace our technology, and Cid is also a reminder that everybody needs a crotchety old grandpa or uncle or somebody to set them straight and keep them in line and make sure that the warriors of light can ultimately fulfill their destiny
I think basically what you just described is my job as a high school librarian. I think we're done.
So yes, there must be a Cid. There must be a Cid.
There must be a Cid. Agreed.